This 1857 Plantation portrait looks formal until you notice the boy's collar. At first glance, it seemed like any other antebellum portrait. A prosperous white man seated in a velvet chair, a young black attendant standing behind him, both figures frozen in the careful stillness that early photography required. Thousands of such images exist in archives across the American South, but this one would not let the investigator go, because once she saw what was wrong with that collar, she could never unsee it. Dr. Lorraine Okafor was 53 years old and had spent the last 20 of those years as a senior curator of photography at a university archive in Atlanta. She had processed more daguerreotypes, ambrotypes, and tintypes than she could count. Portraits of wealthy planters, yeoman farmers, merchants, ministers, wives posed beside pianos, children gripping toys, soldiers stiff in new uniforms. Each one a window into how the South wanted to remember itself. And Lorraine had become expert at reading what those windows tried to hide. The portrait arrived in late autumn as part of a donation from a family estate sale in rural Burke County. The collection included 47 images spanning from 1852 to 1889, most of them unremarkable. Studio portraits, landscape views, a few post-mortem photographs of infants in their burial clothes. Lorraine cataloged them methodically, entering dimensions and condition notes into the database until she reached item number 31. The image was an ambrotype, housed in a hinged leather case with a decorative brass mat. The glass showed minor deterioration along one edge, but was otherwise intact. The composition was standard for the era. A seated white man, perhaps 50 years old, dressed in a dark frock coat with a high collar and silk cravat. His hands rested on his thighs, fingers splayed in a gesture meant to suggest ease. Behind him and slightly to the left stood a black boy, perhaps 14 or 15, wearing the livery of a house servant. A fitted jacket with brass buttons, a white shirt, dark trousers. His hands were clasped behind his back, his expression carefully neutral. Lorraine had seen 100 images like this. The visual grammar was familiar. The planter at the center, the enslaved attendant positioned to signal wealth and status. The boy was a prop, a symbol of the man's prosperity, his humanity reduced to decoration. She almost moved on. Almost. But something about the collar stopped her. The boy's shirt had a high standing collar, which was typical of formal servant attire in the 1850s. What was not typical was the way the collar was closed. Instead of a button or a simple fold, the fabric at the throat appeared to be stitched shut. The seam was visible even in the faded image, a thick vertical line of thread running from just below the jaw to the top of the collarbone. It was not decorative. It was not a stylistic choice. It looked like a hasty repair, the kind of thing you might do if you needed to hide something underneath. Lorraine adjusted her magnifying loupe and leaned closer. The stitching was uneven, done by an unpracticed hand. And now that she was looking, she noticed something else. The boy's posture was rigid, more rigid than the long exposure time would require. His chin was tilted slightly upward, as if he were trying to stretch his neck away from something pressing against the skin. She had seen photographs of enslaved people wearing iron collars. She had seen advertisements for runaways that described scars from shackles and restraints, but she had never seen evidence of that violence in a formal portrait. The whole point of these images was to project order, civility, refinement, to suggest that slavery was a benevolent institution, that enslaved people were content in their roles. You did not photograph the wounds, you covered them up. Unless, of course, someone was looking closely enough to notice. Lorraine turned the case over in her hands. On the back, in faded pencil, someone had written a name and a date. Harwell Gideon Marsh, 1857. Below that, in different handwriting, a second notation. Personal attendant Marcus, property of HGM. She set the photograph down carefully and stared at it for a long time. She had been doing this work for 2 decades. She had learned to read the silences in these images, the absences, the things that were not supposed to be seen. But this was different. This was evidence of something specific. A boy named Marcus, standing behind his owner, wearing a collar that had been sewn shut to hide what was underneath. And whoever had taken this photograph, whoever had developed the plate and mounted it in its leather case, had not noticed, or had not cared, or had been complicit. This was not just a portrait. This was a crime scene. Lorraine Okafor was not the kind of person who let things go. She had grown up in Macon, the daughter of a Nigerian immigrant father and a black American mother whose family had been in Georgia since before the Civil War. Her grandmother used to say that every old photograph in the South was a lie that told the truth, if you knew how to read it. Lorraine had built her career on that principle. She had authenticated images, debunked forgeries, and uncovered hidden narratives in collections that other scholars had dismissed as routine. But she had never encountered anything quite like this. The day after she found the photograph, she returned to the archive early and began her standard protocol. She removed the ambrotype from its case using cotton gloves, photographed it under controlled lighting, and examined the plate under magnification. The image quality was good for its era. The photographer had used a proper exposure time, and the chemical processing had been competent. The brass mat bore no studio mark, which was unusual but not unheard of for rural Georgia in the 1850s. She turned her attention to the case itself. The leather was worn, but intact, the brass hinges still functional. Inside the lid, embossed in gold, was a small oval frame that might once have held a second image or a lock of hair. It was empty now, but in the corner of the velvet lining, Lorraine noticed a tiny tear. She probed it gently with a pair of tweezers and extracted a folded slip of paper, brittle with age. The paper was a receipt, dated March 14, 1858. It recorded the sale of one enslaved male, approximately 16 years of age, described as trained for personal service, sound in body and disposition. The seller was listed as H.G. Marsh of Burke County. The buyer was a man named Solomon Whitford of Savannah. The price was $800. At the bottom, in the same cramped handwriting as the notation on the back of the case, someone had added a single word: Marcus. Lorraine sat back in her chair. The photograph had been taken in 1857. The sale had occurred in 1858. Somewhere between those two dates, Marcus had been sold. The receipt had been tucked inside the case, perhaps by accident, perhaps on purpose. Either way, it connected the image to a transaction. A boy who had been photographed as property had then been transferred as property. And whoever had kept this portrait for over a century and a half had kept the receipt with it. She began her research that afternoon. The name Harwell Gideon Marsh appeared in Burke County records as early as 1831, when he purchased a tract of land along Briar Creek. Census data from 1840 and 1850 listed him as the owner of a cotton plantation called Ashbrook, with enslaved populations of 43 and 61, respectively. He was married to a woman named Clementine, and they had 4 children, 2 of whom died in infancy. By the standards of the antebellum South, he was prosperous but not exceptional. A middling planter with regional influence, but no national profile. The plantation records themselves were harder to find. Most of Ashbrook's documentation had been destroyed during Sherman's March in 1864, when Union troops burned the main house and several outbuildings. What survived was scattered across multiple archives. Lorraine found fragments in the Georgia Historical Society, the Burke County Courthouse, and a small collection at a Baptist church in Waynesboro, whose pastor had been a Marsh family friend. It was in that church collection that she found the first mention of personal attendants. The document was a letter from Harwell Marsh to his brother in Augusta, dated October 1849. Marsh was complaining about the difficulty of training house servants. Field hands, he wrote, could be worked in gangs and supervised by overseers, but a personal attendant required individual attention. He had to be taught to dress properly, to speak when spoken to anticipate his master's needs. Most importantly, he had to be taught to appear content. A sullen servant reflects poorly on his owner, Marsh wrote. I have found it necessary to employ certain methods of correction that leave no visible marks. The collar device, used judiciously, produces compliance without disfigurement. Lorraine read the sentence 3 times. The collar device, used judiciously, produces compliance without disfigurement. She photographed the letter and continued searching. Dr. Emmett Rhodes was a historian at Georgia State University who specialized in the material culture of slavery. Lorraine had worked with him before on a project involving blacksmith records from coastal plantations. When she showed him the photograph and the letter, he was silent for a long moment. "Spiked collars are well documented," he said finally. "They were used to punish runaways and to prevent escape. But what Marsh is describing is different. He's talking about a restraint device that could be concealed, something that caused pain without leaving scars that would be visible to buyers." He pulled up an image on his computer. It was a line drawing from an 1830s abolitionist pamphlet showing various instruments of torture used on enslaved people. Among them was a device labeled iron cravat. It consisted of a hinged metal band that fit around the neck, with interior prongs that pressed into the flesh when the wearer moved too quickly or turned their head. The outer surface was smooth, Rhodes explained. You could cover it with fabric, and from a distance it would look like an ordinary collar, but any sudden movement would drive the prongs into the skin. Over time, the wounds would scar. Lorraine thought of the stitched collar in the photograph, the way Marcus's chin was tilted upward, the rigidity of his posture. "If someone wore that device for months or years," she said, "and then you removed it for a sale, the scars would still be there." "Exactly. So you'd need to hide them. A high collar, stitched shut, would do the job. The buyer might not notice until after the transaction was complete, and by then, the sale would be final." The implications were staggering. Marsh had not simply used physical restraints to control his enslaved attendants. He had systematically concealed the evidence of that abuse in order to sell them at full market value. The photograph was not just a portrait, it was part of a fraud. Marcus had been prepared for sale, his injuries hidden, his sound body and disposition manufactured for the camera. But the question remained, was Marcus an isolated case or part of a larger pattern? Lorraine spent the next 3 months tracing every sale record she could find connected to Ashbrook Plantation. The work was painstaking. Most transactions were recorded only in fragments, a name here, a price there, a vague description that might or might not match a specific person. But gradually, a pattern emerged. Between 1845 and 1860, Harwell Marsh sold at least 14 enslaved males between the ages of 12 and 20, all described as personal attendants or house servants. The prices were consistently high, ranging from $600 to $1,200, well above the average for comparable workers. The buyers were scattered across Georgia, South Carolina, and Louisiana. And in almost every case, the sale occurred within 2 years of the individual being acquired by Marsh. He was not raising these boys from childhood. He was purchasing them young, training them, and then reselling them at a profit. The personal attendants were a product line. Lorraine found corroboration in an unexpected source. The Freedmen's Bureau records from 1866 included a deposition from a man named Silas Turpin, who had been enslaved at Ashbrook from 1851 to 1858. Turpin described the plantation's internal hierarchy, with field hands at the bottom and house servants at the top. But he also described a third category: boys who were kept separate from both groups, housed in a small cabin behind the main house, and subjected to what he called breaking. They would put the iron on a boy's neck and leave it there for weeks, Turpin testified. If he cried or struggled, the barbs would go deeper. After a while, he learned to be still. He learned not to make a sound. That was what Master Marsh called a finished boy, ready for sale. The deposition went on to describe what happened after the breaking was complete. The restraints were removed. The wounds were treated with salves to minimize scarring. The boys were given fine clothes and taught to stand properly, to pour drinks, to light cigars. They were photographed, sometimes alone, sometimes with Marsh himself. And then they were sold, their histories erased, their bodies presented as unmarked and compliant. Silas Turpin estimated that he had seen at least a dozen boys go through this process during his 7 years at Ashbrook. He could remember some of their names: Joseph, Peter, Daniel, Marcus. The photograph on Lorraine's desk was not unique. It was one image from an assembly line of abuse. The discovery of the Ashbrook system forced Lorraine into a decision she had been dreading. The university archive where she worked was a respected institution with a carefully cultivated reputation. Its donors included several prominent Georgia families whose ancestors had owned enslaved people. Its board of trustees included businessmen, politicians, and philanthropists who valued discretion. And its mission statement emphasized Preserving the Heritage of the American South. When Lorraine presented her findings to the archive director, a white man named Dr. Charles Pennington, his first question was about verification. "Can you prove any of this?" he asked. "The photograph is suggestive, but it's not conclusive. The letter mentions a collar device, but it doesn't describe exactly what you're claiming. The Freedmen's Bureau deposition is hearsay from a single witness." "It's not hearsay," Lorraine said. "It's testimony. And I have 14 sale records that match the pattern Turpin described. Boys acquired young, sold within 2 years, all at premium prices. That's not coincidence." Pennington frowned. "Even if you're right, what exactly do you want us to do? We can't change what happened. We can't bring these people back. We can tell the truth about what this photograph shows. We can stop displaying it as a neutral artifact and start contextualizing it as evidence of a specific system of abuse. And how do you think our donors will react to that?" The meeting ended without resolution. Pennington asked Lorraine to prepare a formal report, which he would share with the Board of Trustees. She spent 2 weeks writing it, documenting every source, annotating every claim. She included high-resolution scans of the photograph, the receipt, the Marsh letter, the Turpin deposition. She traced the provenance of the image from the 1857 studio session to the 2023 estate sale. She identified the descendants of Harwell Marsh, some of whom still lived in Georgia, and the descendants of Solomon Whitford, the man who had purchased Marcus. She also reached out to Dr. Keisha Marshall, a genealogist who specialized in tracing African American families from slavery through the present day. Marshall had spent years building a database of enslaved individuals from Georgia records, and she agreed to search for any trace of Marcus after his 1858 sale. The search took several months. Sale records from Savannah showed that Solomon Whitford had owned a townhouse on Oglethorpe Square and a small rice plantation on the Ogeechee River. He had purchased Marcus, according to the receipt, as a body servant for his eldest son. But Whitford died in 1861, and his estate was divided among his heirs. The enslaved people on his properties were dispersed through a combination of inheritance and sale. Marshall eventually found Marcus in a Confederate hospital record from 1864. He had been requisitioned, along with several other enslaved men, to serve as laborers at a military hospital in Macon. A brief notation indicated that he had died there in September of that year, cause listed as camp fever. He was approximately 23 years old. There was no photograph of Marcus as an adult, no record of a wife or children, no grave marker, no death certificate, no obituary. The last documentary evidence of his existence was a single line in a ledger book recording that an enslaved man named Marcus had died of typhoid and been buried in an unmarked trench with 14 other laborers. His life, from the moment he was first purchased by Harwell Marsh to the moment he was lowered into that trench, had been defined by other people's decisions, other people's violence, other people's profit margins. All that remained was a photograph in which his wounds had been hidden and a receipt for his sale. The Board of Trustees met in January. Lorraine was not invited to attend, but she was asked to submit her report in advance. 2 weeks later, she received an email from Pennington informing her that the board had discussed the matter and reached a decision. The photograph of Harwell Marsh and Marcus would not be included in any public exhibition. The report would not be published. The archive would retain the image in its collection, but it would be classified as sensitive material, and access would be restricted to approved researchers. The board felt that the evidence, while compelling, was not definitive, and that publicizing the findings could expose the university to reputational risk. Lorraine read the email 3 times. Then she called Dr. Marshall. "They're burying it," she said. "Of course they are," Marshall replied. "Did you expect anything different?" "I expected them to at least pretend to care. They care about the wrong things. But that doesn't mean the story has to stay buried." Marshall had a contact at a national magazine that had published investigative pieces on the history of slavery before. She made an introduction. Lorraine spent the next 6 months working with a journalist named Tara Simpkins on a long-form article that would tell the full story of Ashbrook Plantation, the collar device, the grooming of enslaved boys for sale, and the photograph that had exposed it all. The article was published in the fall. It included reproductions of the photograph, the receipt, and key passages from the Marsh letter and the Turpin deposition. It traced the lives of several Ashbrook survivors through Freedmen's Bureau records and pension files. It quoted historians, archivists, and descendants, and it named the university archive that had tried to suppress the findings. The response was immediate and polarized. Some readers praised the article as essential scholarship, a corrective to the sanitized narratives that had dominated Southern history for generations. Others accused Lorraine of fabricating evidence, of being motivated by racial grievance, of trying to smear the reputations of respectable families. She received letters of support from scholars and activists. She also received death threats. The university issued a statement expressing disappointment that Dr. Okafor had chosen to publicize preliminary findings without institutional approval. 2 trustees resigned. Pennington announced his retirement, and the photograph of Harwell Marsh and Marcus was quietly transferred to a different archive, one that agreed to display it publicly with full contextual information about what it depicted. The new exhibition opened the following spring. The photograph was mounted in a climate-controlled case surrounded by explanatory panels. One panel reproduced the Marsh letter, another showed the sale receipt, a third displayed the Turpin deposition, a fourth traced Marcus's life from purchase to death using the fragmentary records that Marshall and Lorraine had assembled, and a fifth panel posed a question to visitors. How many other photographs hide similar stories? Lorraine attended the opening. She stood in front of the case for a long time, looking at the image she had first encountered in her archive nearly 2 years earlier. Marcus stared back at her, his expression still neutral, his collar still stitched shut, his hands still clasped behind his back. He had been posed to be invisible, to be a symbol of his owner's wealth, not a person with a history and a future. The photographer had captured his image, but not his name. The receipt had recorded his sale, but not his thoughts. The hospital ledger had noted his death, but not his life. And yet, somehow, he had survived. Not as a person, but as evidence. The very image that had been designed to erase him had become the means of his recovery. The stitched collar that had hidden his wounds had also preserved them. The photographer who had meant to document property had accidentally documented crime. A woman approached Lorraine as she stood in front of the case. She was in her 70s, with gray hair and dark skin, and she introduced herself as Doreen Whitford. "I'm a descendant of Solomon Whitford," she said, "the man who bought Marcus." Lorraine did not know what to say. She had traced Whitford's family tree as part of her research, but she had not reached out to any living descendants. She had not known how they would react. "I want to thank you," Doreen said. "My whole life, I knew my family had owned slaves. My grandmother used to talk about the old plantation, the servants, the way things used to be. She made it sound almost gentle, like everyone was taken care of. I never questioned it." She paused, looking at the photograph. "But seeing this, reading what you found, I understand now. They weren't taken care of. They were tortured. They were broken. And then they were sold, and nobody remembered them. Nobody even knew their names." She reached into her purse and pulled out a small envelope. "I found this in my grandmother's papers after she died. I didn't know what it was until I read your article." Inside the envelope was a photograph, another ambrotype, smaller than the Marsh portrait, housed in a simple wooden frame. It showed a young black man, perhaps 18 or 20, wearing a white shirt and dark jacket. His collar was open, his neck was visible, and across his throat, faint but unmistakable, were the scars. "I think it's him," Doreen said. "I think it's Marcus. Someone in my family took this picture after they bought him, before he was sent to the hospital, before he died." Lorraine took the photograph carefully. The young man in the image had the same bone structure as the boy in the Marsh portrait, the same wide-set eyes, the same guarded expression, but his posture was different, looser, less rigid, and his collar was open, revealing what the first photograph had hidden. 2 images of the same person, one designed to conceal, one that accidentally revealed. Together they told a story that neither could tell alone. Doreen Whitford donated the second photograph to the archive. It now hangs beside the first. 2 images separated by a small plaque that reads, "Marcus, enslaved, c. 1842 to 1864, remembered." There are thousands of antebellum photographs in archives across the American South. Most of them look innocuous. A family posed on a porch, a merchant standing in front of his store, a minister with a Bible in his hands. We glance at them and see the past as the past wanted to be seen. Orderly, prosperous, civilized, but the camera does not lie even when the photographer intends it to. Every image contains details that escape the frame. A shadow in the wrong place, a hand gripping something too tightly, a collar stitched shut at the throat. These are the fractures in the surface, the places where the violence underneath breaks through. Harwell Marsh wanted to document his wealth. He wanted to show that he was a man of refinement, attended by a well-trained servant in fine livery. He hired a photographer, posed for the camera, and produced an image that would circulate among his peers as proof of his status. He did not intend to leave evidence of his cruelty. But the stitched collar betrayed him. The receipt tucked into the case betrayed him. The testimony of a man who survived Ashbrook and lived to tell the Freedmen's Bureau what he had seen betrayed him. Marcus could not speak for himself. His voice was not recorded. His thoughts were not written down. He exists now only in fragments. A sale receipt, a hospital ledger, 2 photographs, and the scars on his neck. But those fragments are enough. They tell us that he was real, that he suffered, that someone profited from his suffering and tried to hide the evidence, and that, 166 years later, the evidence was found. Every old photograph is a lie that tells the truth. You just have to know how to read it, and once you do, you can never look at them the same way again.